Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Making It Real podcast from Old St. Andrews Episcopal Church. Good morning, Corey.
Good morning, Tim.
How are you this morning?
Doing well.
Good, good. We were both rushing around here this morning. We always have staff meeting right before this, and so we had to rush around and get our stuff set up and
Our makeshift studio here.
makeshift studio. And then whenever you think you have everything in front of you, you remember that you put something somewhere else, and it's just that's why I'm using this microphone, because I left the other microphone in my car. So, and the car's not with me, it's with my daughter, who is making a visit to a college today. So, what's going on with you, Corey?
Well, it's another lovely day in Connecticut, and we've got our last cross-country meet of the season this afternoon. James is going to be running, so we're looking forward to a nice afternoon.
Very good.
Yeah.
Very good. All right. Well, today we talked a little bit about what we might discuss today. Before we get to that, I want everybody to know that next Tuesday we will be at Our Companions Animal Rescue, and we will be on site. We will be there with
the director, Susan Linker. We'll be on site in Ashford, Connecticut.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. So we'll get to see some of the animals that are longing to be rescued and see how that whole process works. That is one of the ministries that we support. So we're hoping that people will check out that podcast next week. So today, Corey, I told you that today was your day to come up with a topic, and you figured you'd throw me a curveball today since I throw you a lot of curveballs. So what do you want to talk about today?
So I think it's a big curveball, Tim. I think it's something that is commonplace everywhere in society and in families. We see it everywhere. And it's something we all have to deal with, and that's conflict and conflict resolution.
Yes.
And I think our church community is also a place that, we see where we need to address that issue. And I was wondering how you would suggest dealing with it and what kind of protocols and ways we can go about that.
So conflict resolution. Well, I agree with you totally that dealing with conflict happens everywhere. And it happens in workplaces, it happens in church, it happens in family homes. So it's not surprising that knowing about conflict resolution is an important thing. What's really surprising, though, is how many people aren't aware of how to, in a healthy way, deal with conflict. And we actually do a lot of training as clergy people in wrestling with conflict, and even with that, it's hard to do. And I think one of the biggest reasons it's hard to do is because we are emotional creatures, and our emotions have a wonderful way of guiding us, but also sabotaging us.
Right, and I have to say, conflict isn't a bad thing, is it?
No, I would say that a healthy sign of an organization is when it does have conflict, because it's actually wrestling with tough issues. It's figuring out how to move forward in the future that God's calling it to. And it helps. I think conflict helps us grow. And at the same time, if we don't deal with it appropriately, it can also be destructive.
Right. So what are some ways that we can do that in a healthy way that can also be constructive?
So I think there's three things that I try to apply to thinking about conflict resolution. And I've discussed this a little bit sometimes in sermons, and there's a couple guiding principles I use for myself when I'm beginning to deal with conflict resolution. The first thing is getting away from triangles. And by triangles, what I mean is, let's say you and I have a conflict amongst one. We're upset with each other about something. We can't agree on something going on in the life of the church. And one of the things that tends to happen that human beings tend to do is they tend to try to find somebody else to get on their side about an issue. So let's say you and I are debating whether or not it's appropriate to have dogs in church. And I'm like, nope. And you're like, but I have this wonderful dog. She, Sky makes her way to church all the time. And for some reason, I've got issue with that. And so one of the things that people will do to sabotage stuff is I may be like, well, I know somebody else who doesn't like dogs in church, so I'm going to go complain to them about this.
So does that mean I can't talk to anyone else about it?
No, I don't think it means that at all.
Okay.
I think what it means is, what is your intention about talking about it with somebody else?
Okay.
So let's say, for example, and we're using common players that you and I know because we're on staff together. Let's say I go to Liz, our music director, and say, can you believe Corey wants dogs in church? And she's like, well, I know Corey's got this wonderful dog she loves. And I may go to Liz to get her perspective to help me see better. And I think that's okay. It's when I turn it kind of into a gossipy, get her on my side to sabotage the conversation between you and I, that I think a triangle can become destructive. If I'm like, can you believe she wants a dog? I mean, think about all the things that are wrong with the dog in church. And Liz is like, you're right. I think that that's horrible. And so she and I start using each other's energy to try to, in a sense, attack what you are wanting to have happen. So then she may come up, or she may go to other people and say, can you believe Corey Bowie wants to have dogs in church? And we start rallying the troops to kind of shame you or make you feel bad about your opinion or gaslight you. That's kind of the famous term now.
So how do we avoid triangles?
Well, I think the first way that we avoid triangles is that we would really follow the biblical precedent of, if you have an issue with your sister or your brother, you go to them and you say, hey, I've got this issue. Can we discuss this? Now that gets complicated, but I think first and foremost, and there's even biblical precedent, that you go to the person you have the issue with. You don't go to the next door neighbor and complain about the person. You don't go to somebody else within the parish and try to get them on your side. You simply say, Corey, I realize you want to have dogs in worship. I have an issue with that. Can we talk about this?
And I guess I could ask you what your issues are, and we could discuss it.
Exactly.
And I guess listening and to each other is probably a big component of this.
Yes, very much so. Listening with the intention of making sure that I'm understanding where you're coming from, not listening so that I can then develop an argument to attack you.
Or not necessarily you're going to agree with each other.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. We may cut, and so that there's biblical precedent. Then let's say two people have a conflict, they can't get it worked out. Well, biblically, we hear about, well, then you need to take it to the elders, the leaders. So let's say you and I just can't make a decision about this. So you and I together, not you go to the warden and then I go to the warden to try to get him. We say, we can't get a resolution to this. So let's say Rich Malley, he's one of our wardens. Rich, would you be willing to sit down with Corey and me, because we have a conflict that we can't resolve? And we ask that person to join us in the conversation in a mediation role. Now, I've had to do that as a clergy person if there's conflict amongst parishioners or conflict among staff members, where I'm invited to the conversation to try to assist in making sure that there's a listening process going on. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Now, the biblical precedent, and this is where things can get really challenging, is when the elders or the leadership can't assist people in conflict, then it gets taken to the larger community. I don't think we get to that step too much, because usually we're able to resolve it in those other steps. But sometimes issues have to be taken to the community. We see that in local political situations.
Right.
Bring it before the board of the town or whatever, school board. But there's a second step in here when two people are dealing with conflict that I get from my premarital sessions that I use an organization called Prepare Enrich, and it's a company that provides all kinds of counseling resources, especially for premarital or marital conflict situations. And I use this when I'm counseling a couple before they get married. And one of the sessions is on conflict resolution. And there's kind of, it's like a 10-step process. And the first process is if there's a conflict, the first step that it asks you to deal with is to say to yourself, what do I bring to the conflict? So what part of the issue am I bringing that's creating the conflict? So a little self-reflection.
Sure.
And then you get to the step where, there's this kind of self-reflection that then kind of leads to this step where it's kind of like, I guess the way to phrase it is, how am I fueling the problem? So what I've discovered in counseling materials is that one of the first steps you deal with in conflict resolution is asking, how am I adding to the conflict?
I can see where that can be a hard step for some people because they're focusing on the problem and not what they're bringing to it or how they're viewing it. They're looking at it that this is a problem and it's not me, it's something else. So how do we get beyond that?
Exactly. And this is while it's, I think, the most healthy or the healthiest part of conflict resolution to self-reflect, it's also the most difficult. Now, my first recommendation to anyone who has a really hard time with self-reflection is to find a good counselor, a good therapist to help one learn how to do self-reflection, because self-reflection is so critical to any sort of communal life. What am I bringing to the table? So, and I'll be honest, I mean, that's hard to do. That's why I honestly believe everybody should have a therapist, because self-reflection is an important part of how we live in community. It's the whole thing that you've probably heard before, I statements.
Right.
I feel this. I perceive this. I'm looking at it this way instead of you, Corey, have this problem because you want to have dogs in the worship and you are forcing your dog care and love onto the rest of the community. Those you statements are destructive. So, so I find that doing that self-reflection, I think a therapist helps with that. I think meditation helps a person intentionally focus on who they are. I think prayer, asking God to help me be more self-reflective, is critical. And so so you have this two-step process. You avoid the triangles. You then do self-reflection on how am I adding to the conflict. And then I think that there's something that happens when people are able to say, this is what I'm feeling, this is what I'm perceiving, that then lets the next step become a conversation of, okay, so where can we find some common ground or consensus? Does it always work? No. Does sometimes conflict require a bigger intervention? Sure it does. Because we know there's big issues in the world. There's things like abortion. There's issues around sexuality, and churches have wrestled with the moral responsibility of around topics like this. So it it's a challenge, but it's worth it if you're willing to invest in creating some steps to deal with it. Now, we both know that there's sometimes conflict that can't get resolved, like people that get divorced. They can't find the common ground. They can't find a place where they can meet in the middle or discover what the give and take is going to be for each one. And so they resolve to dissolve
Right. So
something.
how do you work something like that out in a community? You know, if there are people that are in a point where they feel they can't resolve their issues, but they're still part of a larger community.
Well, I always think back to this phrase that my theological mentor, Charles Allen, who is actually, God bless him, getting ready to retire from a ministry called Grace Unlimited, where he's a campus minister for Butler University and the community college system in Indianapolis. And one of the things that his community has had to wrestle with, because with students,
I'm sure there's a lot of issues there.
there's a lot of issues brought to the table. There's a lot of conflict amongst students. And, one of the things, he's a good Episcopal priest, and we know that Episcopalians have those signs that say everyone is welcome. And he had a time in his conversation with his congregation, these students, where it was like everyone is welcome, but every behavior is not. Which makes sense.
Right.
If somebody's going to come in and yell and scream or hit somebody at church, we're not going to say, "Oh, everybody's welcome." We're going to be like, "You got to change the behavior, or you're not going to be able to stay here." And so I think that one of the things that if you get to an extreme where somebody is not willing to sit down and try to find a consensus or some way to move forward, sometimes then the procedures of a community have to decide if somebody can participate in that communal life or not. And I think even Jesus did that. I think Jesus challenged his disciples. This is the way of the kingdom of God, and if you can't follow it, then I understand, but you may have to get off the wagon here that we're riding together on. And hopefully those moments are few and far between compared to less conflictual situations. My experience is that a lot of conflict is kind of nitpicky stuff within a church. Did we paint the bathroom the right color? And two people have a different opinion about color. And I think a lot of the times those things can get resolved pretty smoothly, or it's a little bit of some rough waters, but people are able to get past it. But then there's those moments you can't. Let me ask you. So you've been at Old St. Andrews how long?
About 14 years.
14 years. So in your 14 years here, I'm sure you've experienced conflict in the life of the community.
Sure.
Have you ever experienced anything significant that was like life-altering to the congregation?
No, not personally. I don't know. I feel that maybe I'm the type of person that might avoid conflict.
Sure.
Or not be so picky about things being done a certain way. I try to be flexible. So I personally I can't say that there's been a point where I've felt like there was something that I really was upset by.
Yeah. And again, differing personalities,
right.
People respond to things differently. There's a lot of times that I may have somebody within a parish community come up to me as the clergy person and just be completely, upset about something. And I'm just working to listen, just trying to understand why that particular issue is such a big deal. And I know that that's my personality, their personality, and we see the world differently. And sometimes it just takes saying that. Hey, Corey, I'm not seeing it like that, but I also want to respect where you're coming from. So tell me more. And a lot of times when people tell you more, you'll find that there's an issue that from their history that is influencing that.
Sure, sure. Or something you're not seeing from your perspective
Exactly.
that they're bringing. And I think that's where listening and just opening yourself up to listening, not saying I'm going to listen so that I can have my mind change, just the fact that I want to hear a different perspective.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
is
And I think, I'm just scrolling through my Rolodex in my brain of conflicts I've seen amongst people where I've been more of a mediating role. And it's just funny to me how people, what we used to call Minnesota nice in the Midwest, and I'm sure Minnesotans called it Iowa nice, is that being civil to one another in the public arena, but then when we're behind closed doors saying, oh, I can't stand so-and-so, or so-and-so makes me so upset. Um, it is funny how we humans just have a hard time sitting down with something uncomfortable.
right. It is uncomfortable,
Yeah.
and it can be unnerving, and you're giving yourself up, and you're putting yourself out there. So I think it's something that a lot of us have to work on,
Yeah.
and it's something that would help throughout your whole world. It's like you said, it's families, it's work,
Yeah.
it's communities, it's it's all over. It's
I would say that I find most challenging, and again, I think this is from my childhood growing up, or maybe negative things that I've had happen in my life. It can be very difficult to receive, to use the cliche phrase, constructive criticism. Um, there are times that people will complain to me or about me to me, and it'll be things that I'll be like, I can't control that. Because that's the thing we have to remember. We can only control ourselves and our own actions.
right.
So if somebody says to me, Tim, I'm going to quit coming to church here because I don't like the way you dress, I can be offended and take that personally and then obsess about, oh my gosh, somebody doesn't like the way I dress. What's wrong with me? Oh, and have it become a self-esteem issue. Or I can say, I appreciate the fact that I'm hearing you say you don't like the way I dress. This is who I am. This is what I wear. This is how I feel comfortable. And I hope you'll reconsider leaving because of the shirt I wear. And again, sometimes those instances, they happen and they seem a little ridiculous. And sometimes people will just leave. But I have to make sure to say to myself, Tim, you can't control that.
Right, because I think sometimes leaving is easier
Yeah.
than dealing maybe with the issues.
Yeah. Or dealing with why is it that you have a problem with that I don't wear a suit to church?
Right.
You want to see me in a suit. What is the driving force behind that? And a lot of times conversations don't get to that level, but when they do, they can actually be, they can open up two people to developing a greater relationship, because they can say, okay, I see this. Do you see where I'm coming from? And sometimes conflict has led to, especially between clergy and parishioners, to great leadership type relationships between a lay person and a clergy person, because they talked it out.
Right, I can see that. I can see your point of growing because you're actually working through or working on at least the issue
Yeah.
of the conflict. And I mean, it's interesting. You bring up a lot of great ways to deal with conflict, and these are things that we're not taught in school. We're not, unless we work on them or look to educate ourselves, it's not something that we all have in our hip pocket. These aren't things that are out there and being taught to us on a regular basis.
Yeah. And, you hear parents will talk about what should we be teaching in school, and you'll hear somebody say, well, I don't know why we need calculus unless somebody's going to go, be building rockets, but we do need to learn how to balance a checkbook or, cook a meal and all that stuff. And I think we could also throw in there, we need to learn how to deal with conflict. And part of that is how we can continue in a positive way to build self-esteem, not destroy self-esteem, by saying, okay, there's this conflict going on. How do we deal with it? Now, maybe schools are doing that. I don't know. I mean, Elizabeth will come home and say that they, in her poli sci class, they debated some hot political issue. But I think that can be different than, how do we deal with the conflict of personalities, or I was brought up this way, you were brought up that way, and our worlds collide. They don't mesh. But if there's one point that I can definitely get across in dealing with conflict, self-reflection is so critical. Why am I reacting this way? Why am I feeling agitated that so and so said this particular thing to me, especially when I can't control that. And that can be tough, but it can also really be liberating to say, okay, I'm responding this way because, one of the things that I'm always aware of is my parents went through a really difficult divorce. And I know that had an effect on me. And, when you go through something like that as a kid, you go to a counselor. Then when you're an adult, one of the things when you go to seminary, you are, part of your requirements are to do self-reflection, do therapy, do pastoral education. And again, then you wrestle with, who am I? Who have I become? Who am I becoming? And that's a lifelong process. Sometimes I think people think, oh, I did 5 sessions of counseling and I'm good. You might be good for now, but you may need in 2 years to go see a therapist again to talk through what is eating at you.
Right. Again, so that brings up the point of knowing that we all bring our own world experiences to our conversations and to our feelings and to our thoughts. And just because you're angry or conflicted doesn't mean it's bad, right?
Oh, absolutely.
So we're saying, and sometimes that's a good thing because it brings things to the table that can be discussed.
I think anger is actually a good emotion because it can drive us to seek change. It's how we let that anger drive us to the change. I mean, if I come in the office and start throwing things at you, demanding change, probably not going to happen. And I'll probably be having a conversation with the vestry about my future employment. But if I come in and say, I'm really upset right now, and I'm really emotional about it, can we talk about this? That can be the first step towards some healing. So real quick for you, can you think of a time in your life where you experienced a significant conflict? And when you run that through your brain real quick, can you think about if it was resolved in a way that was healthy or unhealthy?
Well, we've all had, conflict in our life, but I've had a couple significant ones. And the most significant, I could say, was not resolved in any way. And it was with a friend, and we no longer speak.
Yeah.
And we weren't able to resolve anything. I don't feel that person was being honest.
Sure. And honesty is key. That's why one of the things I teach my kids is, I realize there's going to be moments in your life where you make the wrong choice or you get in trouble. And we all know that our kids are going to do that. And I've always told my kids, but if you're honest with me, I will be able to deal with this with a leveler head than if I find out you're lying to me about it.
Right. It just is. It's easier to get to the bottom of things when there's not that lie. And since you brought up, the different ways of conflict, I didn't realize this person also brought another person in
Oh,
on the
yeah, yeah.
conflict.
Yeah.
And at the time, it I guess I didn't realize what was happening, but it was definitely a triangle. And they bullied, they the two of them came to so yeah, it was hard, and it was a person that I really was very close with, and it's too bad that things didn't get resolved.
Well, I do know that lying makes it very difficult for there to be a resolution. And I've seen that probably mostly in marriages that are
Right.
failing, is if lying is happening um, amongst partners, and then finding somebody to join your fight is it might feel good in the moment, but it's probably not going to lead to a good resolution. And we have this tendency. Humans love gossip. They love a good soap opera. That's why the soap operas when I was 5 years old that were on the TV are still on the TV,
Yep.
because people love a good soap opera. They all that emotional roller coaster, but it doesn't necessarily solve problems. And so,
So how can we as a community, a faith community, try to avoid situations that bring on conflict?
I
Or
do, yeah. I think that's the $1,000,000 question, and a lot of books have been written about it. For me, the number one thing is to first and foremost avoid that triangulation that can so quickly happen. So I have to try to be very diligent, because I'm like every other human being. I love good gossip. There are times when somebody says something, I agree with them and don't agree with the person that they're arguing with. And I have to be very diligent about saying, I hear that you're upset, and I really want to encourage you to sit down with that person in a context that is safe for both of you, and talk about this, and make sure that you understand when you're talking about it, you have to self-reflect and ask yourself, how am I adding to the conflict? Not, I've already gone through 1,000,000 times how the other person has added to the conflict.
Right. So I think that's a good point. If you're not even in the conflict and someone comes to you with this issue, then being armed with that knowledge and knowing not to get involved in it, but to try to help them deal with it directly.
Exactly. And if the person keeps coming to me, oh, Sally is still irritating me, Tim, and you're my pastor, that's why I'm coming to you, then I have to get to the point where I say, so maybe the three of us need to sit down and talk about this. A lot of the times people don't want to go there. But if they're not willing to go there, then I have to be willing to draw that uncomfortable boundary and say, I'm not going to get triangled into this. So if you're not willing to talk to the person and you're not willing to sit down, then I'm not going to be able to continue to try to find a way to help you. All we're doing here is creating the possibility of some sort of sabotage or hurtful thing to happen. Very uncomfortable conversation, but probably the healthiest conversation to have. But then if you get somebody that says, okay, I'm willing to sit down and talk about it, I'd say 9 times out of 10, you can usually get some sort of resolution. And sometimes a resolution is maybe we need to part ways.
Right.
But we're going to at least do that without bad-mouthing each other or being destructive in our conversations with others about. And it's hard because we love to gossip as human beings, and we love it when somebody's going to get on our side on an issue. And so there's lots of times we're going to fail at it, but that doesn't mean we don't keep trying. So, hopefully for those of you who are listening or those who will listen when it's recorded, I hope this is a little bit helpful. Now, we all know that, I do want to make clear, I am not a licensed therapist. So when people come to me with issues, I may meet with them a few times, 2 or 3 times, to hear what they're saying so that I can then give advice of how I think they could best deal with the situation. but I am not a licensed therapist, and I don't even want people to think I am. So I will provide pastoral support and then encourage somebody, if it's a very challenging, detrimental issue, to see somebody who's licensed and has the skills to help deal with conflict. So a lot of people, I think, come to me thinking that somehow the issue will get resolved, and it's not necessarily the case. So you've had an issue that did not get resolved in a way. I mean, it broke a friendship apart. Can you also think of an issue where the conflict was dealt with in an appropriate way? And do you feel any of the steps I mentioned helped that conflict get resolved?
Yeah, sure. I've had, other issues with coworkers that, we've been able to resolve things. And it did take me the step of looking at what I was doing and my part in the issue. And, in this particular point, I think it was a new employee, and I was feeling a little threatened, and I may have been pushing on them a little too much. And I had to realize that and look at it, and now accepted the fact that, we can work together and without feeling like that this person is working to push me out. We're working together, and I can see that now. But I did have to think about what I was doing, and it took actually a little while, a few times back and forth, until I realized that it was more me making a deal out of something that really wasn't a big deal.
And it takes a lot of maturity to admit something like that for any of us.
Yeah. This is hard stuff, and it's
very hard. If it was easy, everybody'd be doing it,
right?
And all the books would have been written, and we wouldn't have any conflict. The last little point I want to say here, and then we're nearing the end of our time, where I find it most challenging, especially as a person who's in a profession that helps people wrestle with conflict, is that it's in families where I find that it's easy to take for granted relationships, and thus a lot of conflict can ensue. For example, I can be great maybe dealing with some parishioners that are upset about something because I'm not emotionally involved in it, but then go home and get into a fight with my kids about something, and all my steps for conflict resolution go out the window because I'm emotionally charged.
Right.
And I find with families, that's where a lot of this really can get thrown out the window, and that's not healthy. We have to remember these steps when we're talking to our children or talking to our spouse or partner or whoever, maybe our parents who are at a different place than I'm at, just by age and life experience. So I want to encourage people that are listening to really take to heart how important it is to pause in family moments and do that self-reflection before engaging or saying the thing that if you say it's going to light a fire.
Right. It's one of the things we say in our house. Take a breath.
Yeah.
Take a breath. And, before, because it can be so easy to come back at someone and say something that you really wish you hadn't.
And, I find a lot of the times I like that idea, take a breath. And I'm the one who usually needs to take the breath.
Yeah, the parents have a lot of pressure and,
yes,
a lot going on. And we certainly can be the ones that come back and start the issue or not respond the right way.
Exactly. And our kids are learning from us. So if I'm reactive and flying off the handle and not taking that breath, my kids are going to learn that behavior, and they're going to be like, well, that's the way my dad,
Right.
And that just creates a vicious circle that has to be broken. So, yeah, it's tough stuff, but I'm glad you asked about it today, Corey, and we could down the road do some more reflection on how to resolve conflict, because we've only touched the tip of the iceberg.
Right. No, I appreciate what you've brought to my question, and I know we're going to be having some town halls And maybe we need to make sure that we have some
Yes.
rules set up for discussions that allow people to have alternating you know, different things, that just because you don't agree with another person doesn't mean that those things
Yeah.
can't be brought up, that
Yeah,
we can have
exactly.
discussions that you don't always agree.
Exactly. So, yeah, exactly. It's always good to have some guidelines, some ground rules for any kind of conversation, especially in a larger community setting. So, all right. Well, friends, thank you for joining with us and sharing in this tough conversation, but I believe an always important one. A reminder, next week we will be at Our Companions Animal Shelter, where we will meet the director of that program and hopefully meet some of the animals that are up for adoption and, not bring any home. And so we're going to have some fun with that. We're also going to take a check for, I think, like $54. We raised all that change, and that's going to go. And we're also going to deliver the items that are in the box. So for those of you who are a big supporter of Our Companions Animal Shelter and Rescue, you're going to want to watch next week. So with that said, God bless everyone. May you have a beautiful rest of your week, and we will see you next time on Making It Real.